You're live.
Good morning. This is Senate Transportation. It's Tuesday, January 30th. We're here to talk about fraudulent or counterfeit airbags. This is our first order of business. And we will have Bridget Morris come up to the witness chair and give us an introduction and introduce the first witness.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is Bridget Morris with Morris Strategies, and I am here on behalf of my client, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Just want to thank you all so much for your time this morning and considering our policy ask, which is to expand the existing fraudulent airbag statutes. I am joined today by Judith Finellis. She just recently took over the Northeast region for government affairs for the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. So I'm going to let her provide you with an overview of their organization, and then she'll pass it off to Craig Orland from Honda, who's one of our member companies who's been leading up this effort in other states. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll be here for any follow-up as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Ms. Finellis, you can go ahead and introduce yourself for the record and let us know.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today the auto industry's views on the proposed fraudulent airbag language. For the record, my name is Judith Finellis, and I'm here on behalf of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation is a DC trade association representing the automakers that manufacture the vast majority of all new cars sold in the US each year, as well as tier one suppliers and automotive technology companies. Supplemental restraint systems, commonly referred to as airbags, are one of the most important safety features of today's automobile. For many years, these devices have saved countless lives and reduced the severity of injury of those involved in automobile accidents. Counterfeit airbags present a serious public safety risk to consumers. Counterfeit airbags are known to malfunction by either failing to inflate or by inflating incorrectly and expelling dangerous shrapnel. The industry believes regulations of counterfeit airbags will play an important role in maintaining the integrity of this life-saving device. This is a critical issue for the industry, and our members fully support legislation that aims to combat the selling of counterfeit airbags. I'm happy to have one of our partners in this mission, an expert on this issue, Mr. Craig Orland, Director of State and Local Government Affairs for American Motor Company. Thank you for your time. Craig?
Thanks, Judith. Do I have to be recognized, or should I just go?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not sure how some states are a little more formal than others. Thank you. As Judith mentioned, my name is Craig Orland, and I'm the Director of State and Local Government Affairs for the American Honda Motor Company. I really do appreciate you guys taking the time to hear about this important consumer safety issue. This has been a real passion for our company and our industry for some time. As Judith mentioned, over the past several years, our industry has seen foreign and domestic counterfeiters flooding the market with cheap and ineffective knockoff replacement airbags. And just to be clear, these airbags are not intended to provide protection in the event of a collision. Many are filled with newspaper, styrofoam, or other debris. Some are just empty airbag covers. And if you go onto YouTube, you can see videos from NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that demonstrates that some of these are quite literally bombs. So these products are making their way into the vehicles of unknowing consumers and have resulted in deaths and injuries all across the country. And I want to be very clear that this is not a problem with the automotive supply chain. These are replacement airbags that unscrupulous repair shops are buying over the internet and knowingly installing in the vehicles of unknowing consumers after they've been in an accident. So like many states, Vermont has a law on the books against airbag fraud, but that law has a couple of loopholes that this legislation would close. First, the existing law only deals with those who install or reinstall these parts of the vehicles. It doesn't address the big fish who are knowingly and intentionally manufacturing and otherwise trafficking these products. Secondly, it fails to properly define what an airbag is. Airbag systems are amazingly complex and have hundreds of component parts, including inflators and complex diagnostic systems. So over the years, our industry has brought cases to prosecutors in states who have been unwilling to prosecute because they interpret airbags simply to be the cushion material, even though that clearly goes against the legislative intent of these laws. And most importantly, by preventing the knowing and intentional trafficking of these products, our proposal will allow for state and federal law enforcement agencies to work together in order to keep these products out of customers' cars in the first place. So for many years, our industry has been working closely with federal law enforcement to address this growing problem. The vast majority of these products are produced overseas and are imported to the US. Unfortunately, while the federal government is eager to help, they have very limited authority to confiscate these products at the border. There's no federal law preventing the importation of many of these knockoffs. Federal agents can only act in defense of federal trademark laws and in some limited cases, hazmat labeling laws. So driver's side airbags will have a Honda H or a Ford Oval, but modern vehicles have several airbags throughout the cabin, and many like side curtain airbags are simply labeled airbag or SRS, standing for supplemental restraint system, with no actual trademark to defend. And as a result, federal law enforcement has to let those products into the country, even if they detect them. And the reality is that once these products enter the chain of commerce, it's incredibly difficult to track them. So as we've enacted laws across the country, updating these laws, we've flagged them for Homeland Security, which has allowed state and local law enforcement agencies to share information, and it's empowered federal authorities to flag and seize these products at the border in defense of state laws with the consent of the state governments. It's also given prosecutors an additional tool to leverage defendants so that we can identify vehicles that may have counterfeit airbags in them and alert the owners about these problems before they can cause any damage. As Judith may have mentioned, similar legislation has been enacted in 34 states with overwhelming bipartisan support and the support of a number of stakeholders, including AAA, the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, the National Safety Council, our dealer partners, and others. And while it's impossible to fully know the size and scope of an underground economy, we do know that this is a very real problem, and this bill will have a real impact on public safety. As I alluded to before, we've tied these products to deaths and injuries around the country, from Maryland to Texas to California. And in our written testimony, we've provided some YouTube videos to some news stories there. And additionally, through the Takata airbag recall a few years ago, Honda found hundreds of counterfeit airbags in knowing consumers' cars all across the country. We've been working with law enforcement to enforce these laws on a number of occasions. One man in North Carolina was arrested who made over $1.7 million in just under a year, selling over 7,000 fake airbags. Additionally, in California, we supported an LAPD raid that was made possible by similar legislation. There were hundreds of fake airbags found in that raid, and they were deemed so dangerous that they couldn't be transported to an evidence locker. Ultimately, the LAPD bomb squad was called in to detonate them. So I hope that gives you a sense of the problem we're trying to solve here. I really appreciate your interest in this issue, and we're happy to answer any questions you guys might have. Thank you.
So the fact that this problem has gotten to be so big, where'd the failures happen to let it to be to this level? I can't imagine that the National Highway Safety Board or any of your organizations, where somewhere the failures have been greater somewhere along the way. Where were those failures?
I wouldn't necessarily say they were failures. I would say this is just sort of an opportunity of greed and convenience. Airbags are one of the few parts where there is not a legitimate aftermarket provider. So the only airbags you're going to get are from OEMs or from our suppliers. And they're very expensive parts. So what we're seeing is people importing these cheap knockoffs for $30, $40, $50, importing them to the United States, and then selling them through eBay, Alibaba, Amazon, some of these other online retailers to a repair shop who will then invoice an insurance company for the hundreds of dollars in actual airbag costs, and then committing basically fraud at that stage. As I mentioned before, we've done this in 34 states. we've only prosecuted about 15 people as a result. So it's a fairly narrow scope. But as I mentioned before, those folks who are doing this on a big scale. That North Carolina man had sold over 7,000. So it's a pervasive problem. It's certainly a very real problem, but it's a limited amount of folks who are doing this, and those are the ones we're really targeting.
So you guys, all of your alliances and all of that. Was in the car business for 20 years, at a successful level, at dealers levels, making decisions. You guys, even in your repair shops, after vehicles out of warranty, rely on aftermarket parts. How do we make sure that whatever laws that we put into place, make sure that competent and safe aftermarket parts aren't impacted by any laws that we're going to enact here? Because at the end of the day, we do know that your profit margins are driven hugely by aftermarket parts. How do we make sure that we can protect the public from more expensive manufactured parts when we have a competent aftermarket part that you guys are part of, that you guys use to drive profits into your dealerships? How do we make sure that we don't restrict the public's access to less expensive parts?
That's a fantastic question. And the reason we're limiting this to airbags is because there is no legitimate aftermarket for airbags. We're seeing counterfeit parts, counterfeit windshield wipers, counterfeit glass, counterfeit brake pads, counterfeit air filters. But again, there's a legitimate aftermarket that we didn't want to incorporate into this legislation. So the counterfeiters we're finding are not brand or part specific. The ones who are doing airbags are doing these other parts as well. So that's how we're sort of capturing them. Again, as I mentioned before, airbags are the most prevalent part because they're so expensive. Our general hope here is that, or let me back up a second. The reason that nobody has gotten into the aftermarket airbag business is because for a couple of reasons. It's a relatively low margin part. Again, airbags require a lot of testing. It's a relatively low volume part. Again, if a vehicle is going to be in a collision where an airbag is going to go off, it's likely to either have been a salvage or labeled a total loss, or ultimately, it's not a fender bender, so those types of equations. So that's the reason we're limiting it just to airbags, because there is no aftermarket. Now, nothing in this law would prohibit a legitimate aftermarket, but they've all sort of decided they don't want to get into that business because it's low margin, it's low profit, there's a lot of liability there. Every legitimate airbag comes from an OEM or a supplier.
Senator Madison, did you have a question?
Yeah, how would a consumer know that they have the proper airbag installed? What assurance would they have when they go to a repair shop and knowing that it's a legitimate one or a bad one? How would they know that?
That's a great question. Every counterfeit's a little bit different. Some of them are a little bit more obvious if the trademark is not as on point as others, but it can be very difficult for consumers to tell. That's part of the reason we have a knowing and intentional standard here. While a consumer may not necessarily know, the repair professionals definitely do understand that they're engaging in fraud here. They're putting in a bad airbag because the diagnostic system is going to be leveling off. There's some other tells. Again, under state franchise law, the only place these people can get a legitimate new airbag would be from an authorized dealership. They can't get them on eBay or Amazon. I believe Bridget has some materials to share with you guys that have some images. Again, they're not necessarily packed in shipped together. We have very shift packaging. There's a lot of markings on there that are going to be obvious to a professional, but unfortunately consumers aren't really going to know unless it's too late. And that's why it's so important for us to try to stop these at the border and stop them from ever getting into people's cars and provide a real disincentive for this type of fraud.
Would there be a penalty for the person who did install one, or would there be a fine, or what is the request?
Correct. So this legislation has a penalty for the knowing and intentional installation, reinstallation, manufacture, importation, trafficking. And again, we're definitely targeting the knowing and intentional. If somebody were to have one of these put in their car, they don't know it, they then turn around and sell that car years later. we're not trying to capture those guys. Again, we're really going after the big fish here who are doing this in mass, who are selling thousands to tens of thousands of these products. And again, we're not really changing the penalty from the existing law, which is targeting just the folks who are installing or reinstalling. We're just applying that to the folks who are also manufacturing them and listing them online and knowingly and intentionally trafficking in these products.
Senator Kipp.
I'm looking, our current law, and obviously you can get these on the internet, and we know that stuff gets sold regardless of what we pass for laws. We're getting the problem with vaping, we get it with medicine, we get it with all over. So current law right now addresses the installation. So the repair shop right now, under current law, is prohibited from installing these any of these fraudulent, or whatever you want to call it, counterfeit airbags, if they do not meet the federal safety standards. So our current law prohibits it and sets a standard based on the federal safety. But you want to get with the importation, manufacture, and selling, which is before you get to the installation. I'm just thinking about how would we ever enforce it? I mean, you could pass this, and I guess you could say we can join the other states, but I don't know exactly how effective that is, and I don't have a sense of the magnitude of the experience here in Vermont relative to the installation. So I gather the issue is that we deal with the installation, reinstallation. You don't think we adequately define the term airbag, making it hard to enforce, which obviously is something we ought to take a look at. But I'm just wondering, you want people to confiscate these products before they're discovered. And I'm just wondering what the experience has been in terms of how you're able to intercept and enforce these sales that are occurring electronically. And I gather, I don't know whether we've ever charged any repair shop or whatever with the installation or reinstallation of these fraudulent items. So that's really my question. What's the experience relative to how states are able to enforce these sales that are, we can't enforce them in all these other areas. So I'm just wondering what this legislation gets us, other than perhaps relooking at our definition, which seems to be a problem.
Sure, that's a good question. Let me take that in two folds. Let me give sort of two examples of what has happened in some other states. So I alluded to the North Carolina guy, and this is where we sort of talk about manufacture. So part of the way he was able to get these products into the country was he was shipping driver's side airbags separate from the Honda H. So that way they wouldn't violate federal trademark law. They were arriving into his house from China into North Carolina. And at his home, he was affixing those Honda H's, the Ford Oval, the Toyota logos onto those driver's side airbags. And at that point, he would be considered a manufacturer of these fake airbags. Now, unfortunately, the way this has historically worked is, as I mentioned before, we've identified these to some fatalities. And what's happened is we've had to work backwards. So a cop arrives on scene and sees an airbag has deployed in a way that it usually shouldn't. Shrapnel, as Judith has mentioned, has come out. We then go back and look at the record, or law enforcement with automotive support will go back and look at the history of that car, where it was repaired, where they then get those products. And then we can sort of flag where these products are originating from in China or other places. And Homeland Security will sort of be on the lookout for other things coming in from those locations. And again, if there's a law in Vermont, they can then notify local authorities that, hey, we've got some suspicious airbags that are going into Joe's repair shop, that we're very concerned about, and we can start an investigation that way. So that's historically how a lot of these have worked. And again, unfortunately, it has usually been the result of a death or an injury, but that's how we would sort of go about enforcing those laws. And I'm getting these people on the radar of law enforcement.
Senator Eagles.
So forgive me for asking this question, if I just am not clear. Is there any viable aftermarket airbag company out there now?
No.
Okay.
And there's no state or law that prohibits anyone from doing that. This doesn't change that. They have just made the business decision that they don't want to get into the airbag. You can't go to a Pep Boys or an AutoZone and buy, one of their an aftermarket airbag off the shelf there. They've just decided that's not a profitable business for them. Again, because it's low margin, it's low, high overhead, a lot of liability. Automakers actually take a loss almost on every airbag they're installed because of federal safety standards. So there is nobody who's there. We have some legitimate suppliers who provide those to us. But again, you can't get that at a Pep Boys or an AutoZone or any place else like that.
I find that hard to believe.
Exclusive too, you don't want to.
I know that there is low margins and there's high margins, and I just guess I need to do a little research myself. I just find that incredibly hard to believe that there's not a company out there that would be in that business, because it is a big business.
But
it's probably more profitable than what's being relayed.
But it still comes down to the installation, unless you're doing it yourself.
Right.
That's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you get some of these knockoffs. So I'm just wondering the extent to which we've ever had any experience with a installer violating our current law. It's just a whole new area. We haven't discussed it. I see New Hampshire has passed legislation. It's hard to imagine they're ahead of us.
So if there was a company that all of a sudden wanted to get into this business and we passed this law, is that going to stop competition from wanting to get into the aftermarket airbag market if we pass this law?
As long as they meet better safety standards.
No, I don't believe so. And one of the companies that we worked with is LKQ. They're one of the largest aftermarket suppliers. They're supporters of this legislation. They understand what it is we're trying to do. They've raised no concerns about that. I'm not aware of any other sort of large part supplier hasn't taken a position on this one way or the other. And again, we've done this in 34 states. We've talked to a lot of those guys. They don't have concerns. So I interpret that as they're not interested in getting into that business.
Not yet, though.
Yeah.
They could. So does this law, if we pass this law, does it keep anybody, does it adversely affect anybody from wanting to get into this business?
Not as long as those replacements meet federal safety standards, no.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Do we want to hear about the language from council? Okay.
Yeah, sure. I just would like to
go
know.
line by line.
No, I was just wondering what the experience has been in Vermont.
Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, New Hampshire next door has passed the legislation. So I don't know whether we're stopping a practice before it starts, which obviously you want to do since this is a really public safety issue. It's just, I don't have a sense of what the Vermont experience is.
We can take some other testimony to get at that.
Yeah.
I think we ought to.
Yeah.
I feel better about it.
Definitely. So we'll just hear from Councilor Dexter Cooper on the language. We don't have to do line by line, but you're just gonna tell us.
I'll just point out some stuff, orient you.
And you guys are welcome to stay, Mr. Orland, Ms. Fenulous, and if we have any other questions or if you have any comments on the language, although you're probably familiar with it.
Megan, can you give me sharing access? Oh, perfect. You did.
So efficient.
Yeah.
Okay, so this language is posted under my name. I believe it's from last week. And then after we were talking and there was a question about like, where did this language come from? I put the disclaimer at the top of it. So if you have a copy that Megan printed before you met on Friday, it won't have the 2 lines at the top. So this is proposed by the Alliance for Automotive Innovation with modifications that I made to have this better conform with how we draft. And also, since you'll notice, right on line 4, this is being added to Title 13. It is a crime. I do not normally draft in Title 13. So Michelle Childs, who actually was the attorney who drafted this back in, I think it was 2002 when it was enacted, she has looked at this and didn't see any issues as to making it fit in with
The original
Title 13.
22,
2002. Yeah, and it hasn't been amended since then. So I'm just gonna orient you a little bit, and then I'm gonna talk about subsection A and D a little bit more. So the way the statute is structured now is in subsection A. That's where you get your prohibition. That's where most of the amendments are being made. Subsection B and subsection C, no changes there except for some grammatical changes from the editors. This is where you have what the penalties are. And what I want to highlight here are these are not changing and these are crimes. So you'll see that this is using fine and it's using fine correctly. And there's a term of imprisonment. And why there are the two different subsections is because you have one for violating the prohibition, and then you have one for violating the prohibition and serious bodily injury or death results from violating the prohibition.
So we already have a current law
Yes.
around prohibiting installation. Are those penalties consistent with what we currently have?
Nothing is changing in subsections B or C.
I
So
wanted to be
these
sure.
are,
So if I'm a repair shop and I install one that doesn't meet these standards, I'm
Today.
and that would be the penalty
correct.
today.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is using the same,
So it's just going in the same statute. So the penalties aren't changing.
that's all I
So
wanted to know, is that we are just extending what is subject to penalty,
exactly
not changing at all.
what the penalties are. And then subsection D will be completely, subsection D is a new exemption. And I would probably, you should ask the Alliance as to why they want this exemption, but it has to do with installations into law enforcement vehicles. That is new. And then subsection E, this is where you get the fleshed out definitions. So if you look in the current law, it just has the prohibition applying to an object that's installed in lieu of an airbag. And this is defining terms like airbag, automobile supplement restraint system. You heard them say SRS a few times. A definition for counterfeit automobile supplemental restraint system component. So that is a piece of the SRS that has that labeling mark on it. A definition for install and reinstall, and you'll see that it is only an installation or a reinstallation under this definition if there is then that transfer to the owner. So I think that that would be something to ask the Alliance as to why that is where they're proposing that the existence of an installation or reinstallation takes place. And you'll see when we look at subsection A that there are two different pieces, and one is only applicable for installation and reinstallation. And then a definition for non-functional airbag. And I think it's really important when you're trying to look at what effect might this have on the market and other people entering in the market. The prohibition is on counterfeit automobile supplemental restraint system components. So if you are selling it and you are not putting someone else's mark on it, you're not going to fall under the definition of counterfeit automobile SRS component. And then non-functional airbag. So if it is functional, then you're not going to fall under the definition of non-functional airbag. To make that really just sort of simple, a functional airbag is a functional airbag. It meets the federal requirements. Non-functional is sort of falling under these pieces where it would fall outside of what you would want your airbags in
We're
the
not
market.
making any reference here to the federal standards.
You are in 49 USC, and there should be a section symbol there.
Okay.
And then you'll also see two CRF references. One is for what's required for seat belts, and one is what's required for the SRSs. So yes, there are several references to federal code and regulations here. And then that's going to round out your definitions that are used throughout the balance of the section. And then subsection A, this is taking what is the existing prohibition and expanding it. So the current prohibition only applies to undefined in current law, what it means, the installation or reinstallation or causing to be installed or causing to be reinstalled. And instead it's expanding it. And I would say it's going further upstream for the manufacture, importation, distribution, offering, selling, leasing, transferring. So it's making it subject to more actions that would happen over the course of this being in the supply chain. And then this is where you get your federal reference. It doesn't comply with the requirements of federal code. So that's the piece that's applicable to all of those different actions. And then the second prohibition, this is in subdivision 2, just applicable for installation and reinstallation. I would ask the Alliance as to why they're proposing this. Then it's only the installation that causes the diagnostic system for a motor vehicle to fail to warn the motor vehicle operator that an airbag is not installed, or fail to warn the motor vehicle operator that counterfeit automobile supplement restraint system component or non-functional airbag is installed in the motor vehicle. I think that might be getting at the piece where if the person who's installing it is sort of getting these alerts, then they should know that this isn't something that should be going in the car, but you're going to want to talk to them about that. So again, I'm going to go back to the beginning part. This was the language that was provided to me by the Alliance. It's just been formatted to kind of fit the way that we draft. No changes were really made except for some citation stuff, grammar, structure, things like that.
You want to take your, or maybe you can leave it up. I had a question for the Alliance about the law enforcement exemption. What the purpose of that was?
Sure. So as we've done these bills in a number of states, as I mentioned, we've reached out to a number of stakeholders, including law enforcement. In a couple of states, law enforcement has raised two sort of concerns that I'm not sure if you're familiar with what a pit maneuver is, but when they're trying to take a vehicle off the road, they'll occasionally bump that vehicle. And in order to protect the officer's safety, they will disable some of the side curtain airbags so they don't go off. Additionally, in other vehicles, when they're transporting suspects or people in custody, they'll put a protective barrier between the front seat and the back seat. That sometimes requires the disabling of certain airbags so that doesn't shoot the plastic or the barrier at the person in the back. So law enforcement had a couple of very, very, very specific situations where they may disable certain airbags. Again, we're not looking to wrap law enforcement into this. They asked for those requests in other states, and we've been more than happy to comply.
They're not installing different airbags, they're just disabling them.
Correct.
Which seems different.
It does seem different, doesn't it?
I actually have a question. So in Vermont, this was language that was set to sunset a few years ago. You extended the sunset, I want to say, in 2020, and it had to do with airbags in postal service vehicles being disabled because they drive on the other side of the vehicle. I was just curious if that has come up in other states.
That has never come up to my knowledge.
So that might be something to figure out.
This is exempting them, maybe you go back to the language. This is exempting law enforcement from this part of Title 13, or is it exempting them from some other prohibition of disabling airbags?
So based on what you just heard with the explanation for the exemption, I can put this up if you. Oops.
That would be awesome.
And it's online.
Yeah.
Okay, then I won't share my screen. So it says, subsection A of this section shall not apply to the sale, lease, transfer, installation, or reinstallation of an airbag in a motor vehicle exclusively used for law enforcement. So maybe it's getting at the law enforcement has modified an airbag in such a way that, or had modified in such a way that it wouldn't meet the federal requirements. It might be deemed a non-functional airbag if it's triggering any of those things. And then they go and they sell that vehicle. They don't want to be.
It's not functioning. I mean.
Yeah.
They don't want to be criminally liable. So it could be that there is not an issue if postal service vehicles are not being resold. I just know that that was something that we had in statute, and I think it had to do with the airbags not failing inspection, or the
Maybe
postal
it's
service
about
vehicles.
or causing to be installed.
But because it's expanding it, so it's saying that it's being manufactured, imported, distributed, offered for sale. So if they are offering to sell their, police cruiser after it's done being used for law enforcement purposes, maybe that's where they're worried about it. It's not they made modifications to it. It's that they're then trying to sell something.
Can I make modifications to my vehicle?
So my understanding when we spoke to the Virginia State Police about this was more that, again, I think this was a little bit overly cautious on their end, but again, we're not looking to tie them up. It's sort of as they remove the airbag, then they're putting on a new cover. They didn't want that to sort of be construed as a reinstallation, that they're now taking it out and again putting that cover so it's blocking that barrier. Again, the way this is sort of crafted is that it doesn't apply to those vehicles as long as those vehicles remain in police custody, as long as they're not going out to the public.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. I'm a little concerned that this is not really a transportation issue, but.
Oh, it isn't. It is. I mean,
Justice issue.
no, it's,
So we can talk about that. I don't know. Bridget, did you ever talk to anybody in judiciary?
I think, well, we may have spoken prior to the session, I think just because we're looking at it as a highway safety issue.
Right.
It felt like it would make more sense
Yeah, yeah.
here also. But we are open to, of course, rethinking that if you all don't think that.
Right. I don't know if we want the DMV bill to go to all the judiciary committees and have them.
either that or we could have them look at the language and give their
They may decide that they want us to do it.
There's also a miscellaneous judiciary bill every year.
Oh, there is. Okay. So that might be a good switch to that. And we can say, here's the work that we've done on it. So I can talk to Dick Sears, Senator Sears. Did you have a question?
I was just gonna say, I wouldn't want to bring this to the floor without getting Dick Sears to say, yeah, I don't have objection, I don't want to pull this.
well, particularly when you're getting into fines and
New
and well, right, and also isn't there,
Interim of imprisonment.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A hefty one too. I think it's up to 15 years.
15 years. I mean, that isn't our jurisdiction. So,
Again, that's not changing.
no,
So
it's not changing. But, and also, since Michelle Charles drafted the original, must have come out of judiciary at that point.
I think it was. We can pull that up if you're curious.
I'm still curious whether this is a preemptive strike or whether in fact we've ever had any
There's something I'm
problem.
not getting on this whole thing that makes me nervous.
Well, New Hampshire did it, huh? That's hard to believe.
So, if I may.
Because they don't have seatbelt. I mean, it's
Free
like
or die.
free and die is,
And
just,
so you will.
yeah.
I don't care which. Well,
If I may, Chair. I
yes.
speak freely as to what it might be a concern is that if the automobile dealers are advocating for this, does this just make it a lot harder to repurpose a vehicle that has had airbags deployed, thus trying to drive up more car purchases? And so I don't know who to talk to about a consumer advocate. Like, are we making this harder to keep
That
a
was
vehicle
Senator
that's been-
Engel's point.
Exactly.
So
Only
That's
we
what
do a
makes me
former
nervous.
car dealer.
it doesn't make me against this. It just that's where my concern that we're not
It
here.
makes me nervous. Makes me nervous that we're setting precedent to make it harder to find a inexpensive way, but yet just a safe way, to which the automobile manufacturers would benefit, as they do now after aftermarket parts. It makes me nervous that we are putting barriers in the way to have a company who wants to start up to sell safe airbags, less expensive, and that impacts consumers.
But that's the critical point.
Yeah.
If they're safe and they meet the standards.
Absolutely.
Then they can enter the market and there's nothing that affects them here. It's really for,
You've heard one of the ways.
This is the first time, because this is the first time ever, actually, and I'm not going against the automobile manufacturers, I support that business in a big way. But this is the first time ever that I've ever, in anything that I've done here in this building, that it feels like we're trying to preempt competition from joining the marketplace. And that is something I gotta get through my head to make me, understand what this bill's trying to
we're
do.
trying to preempt competition in the fraudulent markets, Senator Ingalls.
We are?
I think that's.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions for the witnesses, we'll take a break before we switch to blue signal lights, our favorite topic.
Oh, no.
Oh, the blue light special. Oh, boy.
Yes, Senator Mazza, we saved it for you.
Oh, boy.
Thank
I'll tell
you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll be in touch. We have more questions. Yeah, 10-minute break.
Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.